Great. Well, thank you very much and welcome to everyone who has joined today. I really appreciate that so many of you were curious about my talk, and I'm also hugely grateful to Kiara and Elliot for inviting me. I've never given a talk to a university audience before, so I'm really looking forward to this. As Elliot said, he's going to be monitoring the chat during the talk, so you leave any questions or comments there. And as he said, we'll get through those at the end. And also, just to reiterate, we can turn the recording off towards the end. If you would rather ask something that isn't recorded, that's totally fine. I am going to be using words in this talk that I don't particularly like. Part of my work is to find better words and phrases to describe complicated or misunderstood things. There are many words and concepts to replace, but in the meantime, I use words I don't think work, but they're words with a shared meaning amongst us. You may not like them either. The journey I'm on with the Tourette community is all about exploring the concepts that we use to express our lives. And in my talk, I aim to give you a flavour of the journey so far and what I hope is still to come. There's a section later where I use swear words. I don't have coprolalia, that particular version of Tourette's that the media fixate on, the involuntary, obscene or socially inappropriate language like shouting bomb in an airport. And I'll flag when we get to that section. I originally trained as an actor. There's a story behind why performing appealed to me, which is also the reason I still enjoy talking to groups like you. But this is not the story I want to tell today. I moved from acting into computing within financial services. It's another story for another day. But what I will touch on is that at the end of my time in business, I worked in the field of customer experience, insight, research, trying to make my organization more customer focused. I spent a lot of time collecting, listening to, and trying to understand customer feedback, and then trying to get others in the company to take some notice of it, to change policies, pricing, products, to change the whole culture. Now I've come full circle and returned to the theatre as a writer and director. But I mostly prefer to think of myself as a story finder and teller. I haven't come across many people who switch from working in a large company to working in the theatre, especially at this point in my life. But I was a bit of an oddity in the business world and am now a bit of an oddity again in the theatre. I find myself at the intersection of storytelling, neurodiversity, experiential research, and the role of narrative in how we think and interact. This includes the study of narrative in areas like psychology, sociology, identity, cognitive linguistics, and discourse analysis, even evolutionary biology. And the more I've looked into these fields, the more important I see stories are to who we are and how we make sense of the world. We are, as a species, addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. But I won't be making too many quotes from fancy books. I'm not an academic or an activist or an expert on any of the individual disciplines that cross this intersection. Some of you here will be much more expert in some of these areas than me. Perhaps my only claim is knowing a little about them all. I feel the resonance between them, which has become important in what I do now. This resonance is full of possibilities, and I hope my talk creates new possibilities for you, or might confirm ones you already imagined. I grew up in a home dominated with OCD, in a time when GPs didn't recognise it was OCD, treating it with crude antidepressants and electric shocks. My close family now includes people with epilepsy and Asperger's. Into this mix is my own experience. I started ticking, a word I hate, when I was maybe 10, though I can't be precise. I don't even like to think about my severe tics then because it makes me want to do them now. My tics lessened as I left puberty, not uncommon, and undoubtedly helped by a heavy dose of self-medication at drama school. As an adult, my tics were mild and easy for me to mask. Most people at work never noticed or found them so innocuous they never felt the need to ask me. But at home, they've always been worse, and when driving for some reason. A few years ago, TV programmes appeared, mostly on Channel 4, about Tourette's, always focusing on coprolalia, the swearing and inappropriate language. But within these, I started to notice the movements of those with Tourette's, and they were sometimes like mine. I wondered if this meant I had Tourette's. This thought languished for a few years, never getting beyond Google searches. It didn't seem that important, certainly not compared to others in my family. Eventually, I decided to go to my GP. My first visit was perfectly pleasant. She said it sounded like Tourette's. I said, "Do I need to see a specialist?" She asked if I wanted medication, followed by pointing out the side effects could be worse than the tics. I said I didn't want medication, and that was the end of it. I was left in limbo. Was this conversation proof I could just walk out of the GP's and declare I had Tourette's? Was I allowed to make this claim? After a few months, I went back saying I needed some confirmation for peace of mind and was referred. I was lucky. I now know that my video consultation was straightforward, and after a couple of weeks I had my official diagnosis letter. The main outcome of my diagnosis was that my tics got worse. In fact, this had been happening since I'd left my previous job and gone back to college. I'd assumed that leaving the intense pressure of working for a big company would have had the opposite effect. I was less stressed. I was working far less hours. I was only responsible for myself now. Shortly after my diagnosis, I got in touch with Tourette Scotland. I'd had an idea from being in this intersection. I suggested a storytelling group for them. They'd never heard of me before. I'd only just got a diagnosis, and now I wanted to start this odd group. After 5 months, we'd agreed how this would work and launched in December 2020. Quite a few people were interested and came along to a find out more session on Zoom. But when the group started, we struggled to get people every month. As I've got closer to the lives of those in the community, I discovered a couple of reasons for this. First, these families have extremely chaotic lives, so making regular time for anything is a big deal. Secondly, many in the community have negative experiences with education, and writing, even for fun, can feel like they're back at school. After a few months with my small group, I decided to try a different approach. Rather than asking them to write, I would do the writing for them. So I arranged for people to just come and talk to me, one-to-one, over Zoom. I knew at the start that I wanted to avoid making this about their tics, about the external, the obvious aspects of Tourette's. I wanted to know how having Tourette's felt from the inside. I used my experience in qualitative research along with a little bit of what you'd call phenomenological questioning. I had 11 amazing young people who came and talked about their lives with such openness and insight and sensitivity. After 20 hours of Zoom meetings, I'd 13,000 words of notes. Here was the raw material of how their Tourette's felt, and it was very raw. They shared things they'd never spoken about before, even to their parents, who were sometimes just to the side listening and would suddenly say, "You've never told me that before." As I sifted through my notes, three things stood out for me. Firstly, all 11 of them talked about how Tourette's felt like there was another version of them inside that was controlling them or talking to them. We might call this intrusive thoughts. When I checked back with Tourette Scotland, they said this aspect was rarely spoken about within the community. I guess hearing voices or having a split personality are so stigmatised that no one wants to admit to anything that sounds even vaguely like that. Secondly, I asked all of them to rank the different aspects of Tourette's from worst to least worst and tell me what was top of the list. Every one of them put other people's reactions and behaviour at the top of the list, not their tics, not the physical pain, not breaking their own wrist by repeatedly hitting it with their other fist, or stab wounds from pushing shards of broken mirror into their thighs, or the anguish of realising you've just thrown spaghetti bolognese around your dining room. Yes, all these are really, really hard to deal with. But the worst aspect was other people, the staring, the questioning, blaming or pitying. I was especially shocked to hear about the attitudes of some teachers. We tend to hold teachers to a high standard, but the reality is some are very much like the general population. Suspicious, blaming, belittling, and inflexible. Given how school can be such a hostile environment for many kids, I was also struck by those who shared the time they gave the talk, the day they stood up in front of their class and explained they had Tourette's and what this was. I've seen examples of these talks online too, and they follow a similar pattern. Everything was about the person giving the talk. They would say, I have Tourette's. I have a neurological condition. I can't control it. I was born with it. It's in my brain. It's genetic. It's hereditary. In other words, it's nothing to do with you. But I knew this wasn't true, that other people around them were their biggest problem. It seemed wrong to me that their talks never mentioned the impact of other people. I also noticed that a lot of people describe Tourette's as being like a sneeze. I have no idea who started this metaphor for Tourette's. My guess is it was picked as an everyday example of something we do that's involuntary and unpredictable, which seems to fit well for Tourette's. But the schema of a sneeze has other elements which come along with it and are less helpful. A sneeze is seen as spreading disease. It's unsanitary and therefore socially unacceptable. You're expected to do something to stifle it. Use a tissue, turn away, go somewhere else to do it. Sneezes have clear causes: dust, allergies, colds. So when someone sneezes, we assume an obvious cause, or we can ask, do you have a cold? Or are you allergic to my cat? But when a person with Tourette's tics, the question, why do you do that, is mostly going to elicit, I have Tourette's, or maybe, I don't know. From my own experience and in their descriptions of Tourette's, the sneeze just didn't convey what Tourette's was like. Tourette's is a complex, contradictory and confusing condition. A sneeze is pretty straightforward. I felt it was time we came up with a better metaphor for Tourette's, one that encompasses the inner experience and the effects of those around us. But why was I bothered about metaphors at all? Well, because metaphors are more than just occasional literary flourishes. According to George Lakoff, they underpin the majority of our cognitive process. Metaphor is central to our understanding of ourselves, our culture, and the world at large. Lakoff actually gave a Gifford lecture at your university in 2001 on this subject. Metaphors explain complex abstract ideas like love, death, or time. My intersection diagram at the start is a metaphor based on space. The subjects are paths that meet at a point in space where I am. We use spatial metaphors all the time without realizing. I'm flying high. I've reached the top, heavens above. Or I'm feeling down. I've hit rock bottom. You're bottom of the class. Does a class even have a bottom? Almost universally, up is seen as positive and down as negative. My breakthrough in developing the story was to realise the importance of how these young people with Tourette's talked, especially the metaphors they used. So instead of Tourette's being like a sneeze, I wanted to find a new, better metaphor. And from listening to their stories of school or being in a supermarket or just walking down the road, I started to form this idea for a metaphor. Tourette's is like owning the world's worst behaved pet. You didn't ask for it and can't control it. It keeps doing things that other people don't like, but you always get the blame. If you've watched our Living With You video, you'll be aware that this metaphor is never spoken. It's shown through the action. This is for two reasons. Firstly, the overused but still valid advice to show, don't tell. It's more powerful to show an audience than just tell them something. Secondly, this is the conceit for the play, the conceptual metaphor that shapes the overall story. Farrell is a teenager with Tourette's, and his badly behaved pet, Fenn, as he's called in the script, is the physical embodiment of Tourette's. Fenn is only visible to Farrell. None of the other characters can see Fenn. It's not an especially novel narrative device, but it's rarely done in work about Tourette's. With this device, I make the inner life of Farrell tangible. We can directly see what's going on inside. It's also the case that Farrell never swears, which was important to me. What you're hearing is Fenn swearing inside Farrell's mind, but Farrell has to work really hard to not swear himself. So here at my intersection, we have a story about living with a neurological condition expressed as a metaphor, which we understand because we share a cognitive framework of metaphors for abstract concepts. Honestly, it sounds a lot less fun when spelt out like that. I won't include this in my BAFTA speech. The owning the worst pet metaphor identifies an agent that is causing the tics and personifies them as an animal, maybe a cat or dog. The negative aspects of Tourette's are now separated from the person with Tourette's. We understand the properties of a pet. They are not robots we control. They sometimes run off, bark at people, don't listen to us. But this metaphor doesn't absolve us completely. We still own the pet. We're connected to it. It also introduces other people who witness your actions and blame you for them because they cannot see the pet. It gives them some responsibility for judging you, but doesn't place the whole blame on them, because they're ignorant of what's happening inside, what's driving your behaviour. The poster for Living With You tries to encapsulate this metaphor, and there are a couple of other tonal things I'd like to highlight. First, I wanted the teenager to have an element of defiance. Here they are, sitting on their own against a cold wall, but their head isn't bowed. They look out to the world, not expecting kindness, but also not inviting attention. Secondly, their pet, shown as a stylized kind of wolf, is not snarling. They're lean, predatory, but not evil. For me, there's a sense that sometimes the wolf will lie down next to you and let you stroke it. Not often, but sometimes. A minority of the young people in my group expressed that Tourette's had given them some confidence. Sometimes it can be a hell of an icebreaker. It can override shyness. Without their Tourette's, they would have been invisible at school. Living with you was always going to be limited in how much it could show of life with Tourette. So in the poster design, I made a nod to these other aspects that were left out of the version of the script itself. Another thing that writers will do is extend a metaphor to reflect a wider range of experiences or other aspects of a story. Coprolalia is rare. Only 10% of people with Tourette's have this aspect. But I find myself speaking quite often to those with coprolalia, and a recent conversation uncovered another dimension of Tourette's for me. This is the part of the talk where I'm going to swear in quoting a conversation, and apologies if this offends anyone. The man I spoke to was trying to describe his difficulties in social interactions with people he didn't know. Like others I've spoken to, he has an inner voice that is evaluating him. In this case, with a particular focus on whether he is coming across as a normal human being. That was his phrase. He was finding it hard to describe what happens. So let me share a few lines from our conversation. Sorry, I'm not making any sense, am I? Fuck off! No! Badgers! Fuck off! I told him he was making perfect sense, and he said, I'm not coming across as neurotic. I'm just coming across as neurotic. Fuck off! Badgers! You know, it's just bollocks. Sorry! Stop swearing! Fuck off! No, sorry! No, it's fun. No. Fucking words! Sorry! If we pause and zoom in on his words, especially his tics in bold, which are said very quickly, we get a sense of what's happening inside. He doesn't have the right words to describe his experience. In the first line, he reflects on not making sense, and then his Tourette's voice is critical of what he said. He then reveals a concern about seeming to be neurotic, and immediately his Tourette's voice is unhappy that he said this. Now he tries to find a word. Nothing comes to mind, and he says it's just bollocks. And again, his inner voice criticises using the word bollocks when he tics stop swearing. Then his frustration with this comes out, leads to another tic, telling his Tourette's to fuck off. His Tourette's responds no, it has no intention of fucking off, and finally he tics sorry. Is this to me or to his Tourette's or both? Now he tries again, trying to regain control of his thoughts and words. I can hear him searching for the right word, but when nothing comes, he grabs at fun. And again we hear the rapid inner exchange come out. No, it's not the right word. And then his Tourette's is angry at words themselves. A little later, he told me what he wanted. I'd like to be able to explain stuff and that. None of that. You know, none of that. He's pointing at his head, trying to get it out, and it won't let you. Of course, when someone says fuck off to you, it's reasonable to assume it's directed to you. But this example shows an alternative, a constant monitoring of what they say or what they're thinking of saying, a stream of negative evaluations. Why did you say that? That's so stupid. What will they think of me? In this situation, the fuck off is actually something they're essentially saying to themselves or to the badly behaved pet inside them. This isn't so unusual. Take a moment to think back to the most recent time you said something and regretted it afterwards. Have you got a moment in mind? Perhaps you admonished yourself, internally, privately. It's probably no great surprise to hear a writer say that words are important. As I write this talk on my computer, I occasionally have to stop to find a word, or I'll type something and then go back over it, or I read a sentence and decide to delete it. This is the private experience of me doing my job. But in speaking to this man, I see the impact of not having the right words or phrases to hand. His battle to express himself leads to another metaphor. Tourette's is like a never-ending argument between two people. You are the one who can never find the right words to say, and the other fights dirty by constantly assaulting you. You'll never win without the words that they can always find so easily. What is really poignant for me in this exchange is that I'm asking him about his Tourette's as a genuine, caring, curious person, and his act of responding triggers this internal critic, which then triggers his vocal tics, which disrupts his ability to explain, which increases the volume of his inner critic. I don't think better words are a cure for the issues we face in living with a condition like Tourette's. A wheelchair isn't a cure for losing your ability to walk, but it does allow you to get around, to feel a little less helpless. So the extended metaphor is that you can't control your worst behaved pet because they are faster and stronger than you. They are capricious and militant, with the darkest humour and completely relentless. They find words before you can and make you feel like you're always losing a battle with them. I hope you can see the power in the worst pet metaphor. It's not the only one I could have used for the story, and here are some other possible metaphors. A number of the young people talked about how Tourette's took over from them, a sense that they were getting lost. They were only seen for their Tourette's, and yet they really wanted people to know other aspects of their lives, what they liked to do, the films they liked to watch, to be a person without Tourette's. So here, Tourette's is like going around with Kylie Jenner or Dwayne Johnson. No one sees you, wants to talk to you, only your celebrity other half. I could have focused on those who suppress their tics when around other people. Here it's like Tourette's is like holding a ticking time bomb that you run away with to find a safe place to let it explode. Here the person with Tourette's is seen as doing something heroic, protecting those around them, sacrificing themselves, but ultimately being harmed when the bomb explodes. This also speaks to the intense effort it can take to spend a whole day in school or work not letting out your tics. Or we could construct a metaphor for the overwhelming feeling of always being stared at, or the fear of being seen. Some of the young people had been told by other kids or teachers that they were ticking to get attention. Imagine the frustration and anger at this suggestion when the attention you get from something you can't control is so painful. Tourette's is like knowing you are under constant police surveillance. Or Tourette's is like having to take a dump in the middle of your office or classroom where everyone is watching. Or Tourette's is like someone has made a TV show of your life and got Donald Trump to play you, and it becomes a big hit, but they are nothing like you, and you can't do anything about it. And you have a front row seat to every single episode where they spew out outrageous lies and slurs. Or Tourette's is like being the only kid in school who isn't wearing a uniform. You know those days when your only uniform is in the wash and your mum says, "Oh, you'll be fine in your ordinary clothes. Oh, you look nice. I'll give you a note to take." Like a note from your mum is going to stop this from being a nightmare day. We all use conceptual metaphors constantly and automatically. They exert a power over our attitudes that we barely even notice. We accept them as valid, and they have an amazing persuasive power. And it's because of this power that it's so important that those in the greatest need have the most empowering metaphors we can give them. As a storyteller, I'm creating a cast of characters and seeing how they interact. Having Tourette's is not a one-person show. All the metaphors I've shared with you have the same internal structure. There's the person with Tourette's itself, And then the condition is some kind of separate entity, a pet, a bomb, a celebrity, and the other people around them. Creating these conceptual metaphors is an important part of storytelling, but I also had to decide which of the many incidents to include in what could only be a 30-minute play. I picked the incidents from their lives I felt would create a powerful story, but as I looked at my outline, I was worried that I had just picked the most extreme episodes and squished them together just to make the story more dramatic, which is kind of my job, but had I gone too far? I got some of the group and their parents together to share the outline of the story, and I asked them if this was too much, and they said, no, that's pretty much a typical day for us. For me, it's vital that I faithfully serve their truth in the stories I create for them. My approach as a storyteller is very different to a medical professional or a support worker or even an academic. I'm not looking for a cause or a cure or going through a checklist. I wasn't looking or expecting anything beyond people expressing their truth. And whilst my focus has been in the Tourette's community, I feel that similar extended conceptual metaphors would be found in the stories of those people with other neurodiverse conditions like autism and ADHD, or disorders which generate similar inner experiences for people such as OCD. I mentioned at the start that I'd use some words I didn't like. One of these is divergent. I'm not super keen on neuro either. I get the desire to own your difference, to reclaim the labels, to be proud of who you are, especially in the face of ignorance and discrimination. The identity model of disability. Divergence is just another spatial metaphor based on moving in different directions from a common point. If we're all going in different directions, moving away from each other, then how are we going to get on? How are we going to live together and understand each other without some common point? Through storytelling, I'm searching for new metaphors to create possibilities for convergence based on our shared experiences, a coming together through what it feels like to be a human being in the world. Let me describe someone to you. Sometimes they find it difficult to pay attention. They feel like there's a different version of them that does or says things they don't want to. They spend time on their own because they feel safer or feel like they don't want to be a burden on others because they make their lives more difficult. They feel that other people are always looking at them and judging them. They feel ashamed that they don't understand themselves and can't always control what they do. They feel different to everyone else. They feel that their life is stuck and won't change for the better. They have some people who love them, but they wonder if those people would prefer it if they were more normal. They really want more people to like them, to know what they are really like, but they find it hard to make this happen. In fact, the more they try, the more it seems they push people away. Does this sound like it might be someone with schizophrenia, or maybe they're depressed? Could they have anxiety, OCD, autism? Are they an ethnic minority, a migrant? Could they be gay or transgender? Could they be a teenager or someone with Tourette's? Do they have PTSD, or are they lonely? Could this be you? Sometimes. Maybe it's just life. This talk has used a metaphor, one of the most common. Life is like a journey. And on my journey as a storyteller for a small part of the neurodivergent community with a passion for how narrative shapes our lives, I still have a very long way to go. But I am looking for companions to join me on this journey. I hope I've given you a sense of the amazing possibilities from the power of stories to change how we all think about neurodiverse conditions, and why we need a new set of empowering metaphors. Finally, I wanted to share some of the feedback from those in the Tourette's community who've watched Living with You. I'm too modest to read these out, so I'll just leave them on the screen for you to read. What matters to me is not that they are complimentary about anything that I've done, but show that they felt listened to and understood. The 11 young people gave me so much, and I'm proud to have given them back a story that validates what life is like for them. And I want to thank you for giving me your time today. Now we have some time for questions and hopefully a discussion. And I'm going to hand back to Elliot.
I say, well, Nigel, have no doubt at all that I speak for everyone here when I say that was incredibly moving, exceptional, you. Just wow. You sharing the work that you've done and very much yourself has been amazing. And I know that Chiara and I certainly look forward to, well, hopefully, to continuing to work with you for the soon and distant future. So I imagine that there are some people that might have some questions. So Danny has popped something in the chat. She said, Nigel, what other conditions do you think are underrepresented and that you would maybe like to explore?
I think an obvious answer to that. I mean, I think I don't have a particular list. Obviously, because I have people in my family that have autism, that would be an obvious place. And actually, autism and Tourette's is very comorbid. So quite a number of the young people that I spoke to were also very clearly on the autistic spectrum. Some had diagnosis of that, others hadn't. And so that's a kind of an interesting area. But I think that particularly given where I ended up, and it wasn't necessarily where I was expecting to start with when I began working on this, but given where I ended up in areas that deal with what is going on inside somebody, this area of intrusive thoughts, this sort of internal struggles that we have that are not visible, then I think that's the place that I still am very interested in, and so I think that covers a very broad spectrum of various labels that people give to things, and because I'm interested in finding commonalities, it gives me a way of creating commonality, because you wouldn't necessarily, I think, perhaps, or some people say, well, there's much similar between Tourette's and something else, but actually if you look at this aspect of it, then I think there is quite a lot of commonality, and I'm quite interested in because I'm sitting this intersection in finding those things.
We've got a couple more coming up, and we'll take those, and then I will switch the recording off for anyone that's got questions that they would rather not be included. So the first one is from Emily, and it is, do you have any more information on your creative process? How you managed all the stories from the interview transcripts, and like, how did the different stories represent the different characters? How did you integrate those? I think.
Oh, okay. That's so I think there's two things about that question, which is a great question. Firstly, I think during the Zooms, which are obviously all done one after the other, my brain, because I'm a storyteller, my brain is kind of looking for certain things, and therefore I'm able to. I do a bit of collecting as I go, and a bit of. I think that's going to be something quite interesting, or that sounds something quite important, and I put a pin in that. And then I can look back afterwards and see the things that I've collected as I've gone. But another part of that is just having to go back and read through all the notes and make some decisions. There were far more incidents, if I call them that, events that were described than I could include. So I had to make some kind of, it was probably maybe only 10 or 20% of the things that happened to these people made it into the story. But what was nice is that every single one of the 11 had contributed something of significance to the story, a significant moment or a significant attitude in the story. So I think it made it relatively easy when they were watching it. And I had said this to them: you will recognize the things that came from you. Nobody else will know them unless they're in your immediate family, but you'll get where I've picked that particular bit of the story. And I would say that at least 90%, probably 95% of the script for Living with You is based on the stories that they shared with me. Only the end bit, only the last couple of pages, page and a half of, if you've watched the video, you'll know that Farrell at the end has this interaction with Fenn and then has a speech. And that was a construct of my imagination. That was me expressing for those young people things that they had never been able to express themselves. And therefore they wouldn't have told me because they were never in a position to say those things. But everything else in it was just sort of tweaked from the things that they had said to me.
That's that's sorry. I'm quite struck by the answer. It's really good, and so I'm a bit lost for words. We've got two questions that have come up that are quite linked, so I'm going to ask them both together. So one is particularly about employers, and if there's anything you know about either from your own experience or the people you've worked with that could be useful for people to keep in mind if they are going to be hiring or working with people with Tourette's, just to create a more supportive environment. And somebody else has asked, how do you think we can make a difference to be understanding and supportive rather than the problem? For example, if someone's ticking around us, or just in general.
Yeah, I think that, well, there's a lot to unpack there. I know when I worked for a big company, we had diversity and inclusivity training, but it was very dry. It wasn't very experiential. You didn't, I mean, one was being taught to try and identify your hidden biases in things, but not really. There wasn't really much about interactions. What are ways in which you could change your interactions in order to make life more comfortable for people. I think it comes down boringly, I guess, to understanding and doing everything you can to try and make the other person, not feel on the spot. I think as the example that I used of the man I spoke to recently, he's very uncomfortable talking to somebody that he doesn't know. And for something like Tourette's, particularly if you're dealing with somebody who has coprolalia, I think you just have to expose yourself to it. At least I can only say from my perspective, the more you spend time with somebody that has it, the more you can end up just ignoring the tics, the vocal tics that they come out with. And that's usually a very good way of dealing with it. But that does take practice. Swear words are meant to be noticed. That's kind of why we use them. And that's kind of why the internal Tourette's monster is using them too. So it's not an easy thing if somebody is, saying the things they say, particularly if it's funny. The funny thing is also, I had this conversation with several people about, is it okay to laugh if they say something that is funny? And I think generally the answer to this question was yes, if they know that person reasonably well, and no if they don't know them particularly well. But I think, like a lot of people advise, you just need to have a conversation. You just need to have kind of like, is it okay? It's not. They are aware, trust me, that if they have coprolalia, that the things that they say are funny sometimes, like wickedly, hilariously, stupidly funny. An 11-year-old girl telling a teacher in class to stick her homework up her arse is going to be very funny in a classroom. There is kind of no way in which you can get away from that situation. But you need to ask people how they feel about it and get used to it, I think. But I think organizations and companies could do a lot better in how they train their staff, and it be less theoretical, because I'm not much of a theorist, and more about the experiential side of it, and give them some opportunities to practice different different ways to speak to people that have different kinds of conditions.
I think that makes a lot of sense because there's often a fear of saying the wrong thing, and I think that that can result in people feeling like they probably should. It's better not to sort of engage, or a fear of interacting with people that are different. And often, I think, just as you say, talking to someone, finding out what would work best for them is probably a good way to go about it.
Yeah.
So we've got a bunch more questions, but I am going to turn the recording off in case anyone has questions that are a bit more sensitive that they'd like to ask. And if none of those come through, then we'll come back to the questions that are still listed here. Hopefully we'll have time for them all anyway. But for everyone watching the recording, thank you so much.